Okay, welcome to our notes on scientific inquiry. Scientific inquiry, a scientist's tool to answering those burning questions. And you'll find that this method, while we say it's scientific inquiry, you'll be using it, just to solve everyday problems. You'll observe what's going on, come up with a question. Hey, how can I make this better? Or whatever question comes to mind. Then you'll, make an inference or a hypothesis as to how to fix the problem, experiment, see if it works, and then you'll draw your conclusion. So this isn't just limited to science, but it is one of the main tools that scientists use to answer a question or solve a problem. All right, so scientific inquiry. The main part of scientific inquiry, or the part that people get excited about, every time they walk into the science class or science lab, you ask, when is going to be our next experiment? Okay, and while experiments are fun, we have to remember that an experiment is a test or a series of tests that are performed in order to answer a question. All the experiments we're going to do have some sort of purpose. All the experiments we've done up to now have had some sort of purpose. Okay, they're there to answer a question. So what we're going to do now is we're going to walk through a couple of the steps of scientific inquiry, what we start with, and then the first couple things. But in order to do that, we need to be presented with a problem. So here is our problem. Okay? Melissa wants to see if how much water she gives her plants affects how tall her plants grow. Okay, she knows a little bit about plants. You have to water them to make them grow, but she's heard a couple things. If you water them too much, then they won't grow as well. If you give them just a little bit of water, they won't grow as well. So she wants to know what that magic amount of water is. Okay, so again, our problem, Melissa wants to see if how much water she gives her plants affects how tall her plants grow. Okay, so we've identified our problem. Melissa wants to see if how much water she gives her plants affects how tall her plants grow. Now we're going to walk through the parts of the experiment. The parts that we're going to cover today are the parts that you need to have before you can do the actual experiment. So we're going to cover through those. Then later we'll talk about the experiment, and then then a few days from now we'll talk about how you present the results you get in forms of charts and graphs, but that's later on. So let's focus on our first 5 parts of the experiment that we're going to talk about today. So before we can even do a lab, before we can even start our experiment, we have to identify a few things. The first is our independent variable. That's the variable that you change, that you have control over. In the case of this experiment, it's going to be the amount of water. You determine the amount of water you're going to give the various plants, your test amounts. You're going to take some plants and give them a very small amount of water. You're going to take some plants and give them a lot of water, and then you're going to take some plants and give them some kind of amount that's in between the other two extremes. So you're controlling that. Okay, so the independent variable is the one that you change. You control it. The next thing is the dependent variable, which is the variable that may change depending on what you do with the independent variable. It's also what you're going to measure. Okay, so in this particular experiment, it's going to be the growth of the plant, and remember, we always measure in metrics, so it's going to be in centimeters. Okay, so the dependent variable in this experiment, the growth of the plant, is dependent on how much water you give it. If you give it more water, or the plant more water, then it may grow more. If you give it less water, it may not grow as much. If you give it an amount in between, it may grow the best. We don't know yet. That's the purpose of our experiment. But you have to remember, the dependent variable is dependent on the independent variable. However you change that independent variable may affect what happens with the dependent variable. Okay? So dependent variable changes depending on the independent variable, it's also the variable that you measure. Okay? Then we have to identify the constants. These are things that are going to stay the same throughout the experiment. Okay? The reason why you want to keep some things the same is because you want to make sure that your experiment tests and only tests the independent variable. Okay? If you start, so in this case, we want to make sure that our change in plant growth is due only to the amount of water, or how much water we give it. If we don't keep some of the things listed here, like the amount of soil, the type of soil, the sunlight, if we change those as well, then we can't determine whether the growth is affected by just the water or if it's the water and whatever else is changing along with it. So constants are important. They're the things that you're going to keep the same. You don't want them to interfere with your results. Okay? So to recap, independent variable is the variable that you change. Dependent variable changes based on the independent variable, also the one you measure. And constants are variables that stay the same throughout the experiment. Okay? Alright, so continuing on with scientific inquiry, we've pulled out our variables and our constants. And now, with all those pulled out and identified, we can go on to write two important parts for our experiment. The first one is our testable question, and that's just the question that the experiment's going to answer. It's going to be a question that can be answered with repeated testing. The testable question does have a format. What is the effect of the independent variable on the dependent variable? Okay. Again, you can see why it's important to have your variables all picked out, because you're just going to plug them right into the format. If you look at our example, what is the effect of the amount of water given to a plant on the growth of the plant? Again, you can see the independent variable is the amount of water. We just plug that into the format. And the dependent variable is the growth of the plant, and we also plug that in. Okay, so again, it's just the question that can be answered with repeated testing, and you have to follow that format. What is the effect of the independent variable on the dependent variable? Okay. After you've written your testable question, then you can go on and formulate a hypothesis. And the hypothesis is just your educated guess. It's kind of your prediction of what's going to answer. It's kind of your prediction on what's going to happen, in the experiment. Okay? It's a possible answer to the question. You're going to base it off of any observations you've made, any research you've done, and any prior knowledge that you may have. The hypothesis also has a format. It's the if-then statement. So you put if the, and you put in your independent variable there, or how you're going to change it. Then the, and then you put your prediction on how the dependent variable is going to change. Okay, so let's look at our example. If the plant is given more water, then the plant will grow taller. Okay, so you see how we put in how we're going to change the independent variable, and then we predict how that change is going to change the dependent variable. Okay. Later on, we'll add because to the end of it. The because for now isn't overly important, but we will be adding it in the future, so you can get a hang of writing a complete hypothesis with your if, then, and then the because statement will just kind of explain your research or behind this, or whatever observations you've made. It'll kind of just explain why you think that change is going to happen. Okay? So we've gone through the 5 parts, identifying our independent and dependent variables, listing constants, writing a testable question, and a hypothesis. So now it's time to move on to some practice. Practice will be in part 2, so go ahead and click over there and run through some practice problems.